everyone, and welcome to week 10. Today we will be discussing the book Forces for Good. So you should have read the first chapter of that. And what that book kind of discusses is some best practices of high impact nonprofits. So the authors of the book did a lot of research. They did a lot of focus groups with nonprofits across the country, and they selected 12 nonprofits that they felt had really strong impacts in the community. So not just in their small sector, but kind of across really helping society, these large impacts. So we'll be discussing the 6 best practices that the authors kind of outline in the book. So the 6 best practices, here's the list, and we'll go through each one of them. The thing to keep in mind from the book is that, again, they were looking at impact. So later in the semester, we'll talk about some specific metrics that are used to kind of evaluate nonprofit functioning. So a lot of these are put in place by like the United Way, the Better Business Bureau, different organizations that are kind of trying to ensure that nonprofits are being well managed. And the thing to keep in mind with this is all the nonprofits that they chose, they don't necessarily have, a 5-star rating by the United Way, but they've been able to really have these great impacts in the community, not necessarily because they have these well-oiled machines of nonprofit work, but through a variety of initiatives that they've been able to create. So that's just something to keep in mind, that later when we talk about the metrics, just because you have specific metrics, that doesn't always translate into impact. So we're trying to make changes in a specific social problem. We have these different financial metrics, making sure we're spending our finances in a certain way, making sure that we're following certain funding guidelines, but that doesn't always mean that we have impact. So they are specifically looking at how can we ensure that what we're doing is going to have the greatest impact on the social problem that we're trying to tackle. And these were the 6 practices that they were able to identify across these 12 nonprofits. And the nonprofits ranged from Habitat to Humanity, which is obviously a large nonprofit household name. They have several $billions in revenue across all of the different Habitat affiliates. They have affiliates, hundreds of affiliates across the world, to much smaller nonprofits that are specific to specific communities. So it kind of varies. They have varying sizes, and they've been around for varying lengths of time. But I hope you enjoyed that first chapter. If you enjoyed the first chapter, feel free to read the rest of the book. Each chapter kind of goes into a little more detail about each individual best practice. So it's a good read, especially if you are interested in nonprofit management. I would highly suggest it. But for today's class, we are just reading the first chapter. I've read the entire book, so I'm kind of taking everything that I've learned from the other chapters, the more in-depth analysis, and going to talk a little bit more in depth about each of these practices. So the first practice is the idea of advocating and serving. So a lot of you who probably work in direct service are, again, you're clinicians. You're providing direct services to the population, whether that be connecting individuals who are homeless to housing or providing counseling for a specific problem. Those are direct service provisions. And a lot of nonprofits really focus on the direct services, and I've kind of said this throughout the semester, what we also have to care about is the advocacy side, the legislation side. So if we're trying to kind of change laws, that's on the advocacy side. And these nonprofits have been really good. If they're trying to tackle a social problem, you have to be doing both. It's about both providing direct services and also raising public awareness of problems, pushing for policy reform. Because if you have 10 clients who are all dealing with the same problem, let's think about homelessness. So when we're trying to provide housing to homeless individuals, there's different ideas about providing services to the homeless. One idea is the idea, and I'm gonna not have the correct term, so I apologize, but it's called the housing first model. So this is a rather new idea in homelessness services, is that we should be providing individuals first with housing, and then we're able to tackle those mental health problems, because a lot of people who are chronically homeless have a lot of mental health challenges, substance use challenges. So if we don't take care of that housing immediately, we're not going to be able to tackle those other challenges, because people are always trying to meet their basic needs. So if we keep those basic needs served, then we can tackle those other problems. However, this is a relatively new idea in homeless services. For a very long time, when the government was providing funding for homeless services, it was not a housing first model. So it was more of a transitional housing approach. So people were first put into shelters, then they were put into long-term shelters or long-term apartments to try to eventually get them into long-term housing, where they're kind of paying on their own. And this is what the government was funding for a really long time. And it took a lot of advocacy work on the part of homeless service providers to really get the government to try to change their models, to change what they were willing to serve and provide funding for. So then these homeless services were really able to provide funding that was able to impact a large amount of people and really tackle that problem of homelessness, not just by providing the direct services, but on the advocacy side as well, by changing government policies so that it's going to better serve the population and advance the social problem. So it's really important that we're doing both of these. And a lot of nonprofits don't. A lot of nonprofits do one or the other. So it's important, if we're really trying to have the biggest impact on our social problem, that we're doing both of them, because we really need government funding, we need the government support. If we really want to see large-scale changes, the government has so much power, so many resources, and we need to be able to kind of pull those into what we're trying to do. A lot of nonprofits don't want to get into advocacy work for a variety of reasons. Some of the most common reasons might be that, these are social workers, they don't necessarily understand the laws and how to change the laws. There's limited resources, there's limited time. So, why should we be having a staff only work on advocacy when we hardly have enough staff to serve our population as it is? So just really difficult to really solve that challenge of the limited resources and having time to do advocacy work. And of course, there's distaste for the word lobbying. This is kind of a taboo word in nonprofit work. We don't really always have the fondest image of a lobbyist. So we personally don't want to become lobbyists, because we don't necessarily like the idea of lobbying. And sometimes when we advocate for a specific cause, it can turn some people away. Some of our funders might not be super big fans of welfare spending. So if we're advocating for welfare spending, if I'm working at a health clinic and I'm advocating for the CHIP initiative, which I'm sure all of us probably got an email or two from some listserv we're on and trying to push for CHIP, there's plenty of people out there who aren't in favor of CHIP, and we don't want to push away our funders, because the people who fund us are also important. So there's a variety of reasons that nonprofits are going to have a challenge in really being able to incorporate the advocacy component of it. And this is your first lecture question of the day. So kind of, again, looking at what holds nonprofits back. It's going to be all of the above. So it's going to be confusion about laws, limited resources, and lack of distaste for lobbying. But if we want to have the greatest impact, we need to be doing both of them, because we can only make change for one person at a time if we're only doing the service work. But we also need to try to be advocating for the greater good as well, and to really change those laws. Also, to keep in mind, some organizations only do advocacy work and not service. So sometimes we obviously need the service side as well, because we need to be able to understand the problem, and when we're directly engaged in the problem, we have a better idea of what needs to be changed. So the second best practice is the idea of making markets work. So this is the idea that we're going to be working alongside businesses to further our cause. Businesses have a lot of resources. We need to tap into those resources. And different ways that we can do that, the first is that we can help change business practices to advance your cause. So depending on what you're doing, there's an example in the book about the Environmental Defense Fund. So this nonprofit, for the most part, was really good at suing businesses. So they were suing companies who didn't have the best business practices when it came to they didn't have the most environmentally friendly business practices. So they were really good at suing businesses. And what they decided was, instead of just suing businesses, maybe we can actually collaborate with them, and we can work with businesses to make things more environmentally friendly. So the Environmental Defense Fund worked with McDonald's, and they collaborated with them, and they worked with their engineers and their scientists to realize and help them figure out how can you make your packaging more environmentally friendly. You have those, they used to put everything in those styrofoam containers, which would just go to landfills. So they started making, napkins out of recyclable products, paper bags, things that were much better to the environment. And when they started this, not everyone was on board with working with McDonald's, kind of like doing a deal with the devil. You're anti-McDonald's, you're anti what they're doing to the environment. That's how some people saw it. But on the flip side, you can also pull them in as partners, and you're both going to do better. So that's the second lecture question for the day, is who did the Environmental Defense Fund work with? They worked with McDonald's, not Wendy's, not Taco Bell, not Burger King. They worked with McDonald's to start with. And then they were able to work with some other companies. But that's where they really started, rather than just suing companies. They started to work alongside businesses to really make the change from within. The other way you can tap into business resources is, again, another idea of partnering with them is to get their resources through the idea that a lot of businesses are trying to have more of an impact in the community. All businesses want to be seen as community responsible. Most businesses have some page on their website about community responsibility, giving back to their community. Everyone wants to look good. Use that to your advantage as nonprofits. A lot of them have grants. They have foundations. Take advantage of those resources. Apply for their grants, get money. But along with that, not just donations, they have a lot of volunteers or potential volunteers for your company, for your nonprofit, depending on what you do. Tap into those volunteers. The employees, lots of businesses try to have their volunteers, have their employees volunteer together as like a leadership building course. Let's all go volunteer at a nonprofit together. Great. Pull them in. Have them volunteer at your nonprofit. A lot of times when people volunteer, they might bring some money with them as well. The other nice thing that a lot of companies do is some companies will donate money where their employees volunteer. So if they have an employee who volunteers like 20 hours for a specific nonprofit, that company will then donate so much money for each hour that they volunteered. So make sure that you're partnering alongside businesses to access the donations, the volunteers. All of those can really be used to your advantage. The third way you can make markets work is running a business for earned income. So I talked earlier in the semester about what's called a social enterprise. This is the idea that nonprofits will establish a business to earn income. So they establish a business, and then the money that they earn through the business goes back to the nonprofit. So there's a lot in St. Louis. There's like Angel Baked Goods. So this is a company that makes cookies, and the money goes back to a nonprofit, I think in Old North St. Louis City. There's a nonprofit that has it's called Bridge Bread. I probably talked about this already. So it's called Bridge Bread, and the bread is made by homeless individuals. So they provide work for these homeless individuals. They're paid. So they receive payment and work training, work experience, and then the bread is sold to different surrounding areas. It's sold a lot in churches, so that the money can go back to the nonprofit and provide more jobs, more work skills for these homeless individuals. So that's one kind of area that, you can really tap into the business world to further your nonprofit's initiatives. Yeah. The next best practice is inspiring evangelists. No, this isn't the idea of having these large evangelical churches come in and volunteer, although that would be a good idea if you're looking for volunteers. It's the idea that if we're thinking of evangelists, that's a tough word to say. These are individuals who are super passionate, super energetic about something. So you want to be able to inspire individuals to rally for your cause. You can further your mission if you have a lot of people who are excited about your mission. People, when they start volunteering at Habitat for Humanity, think about people who have volunteered at Habitat for Humanity. They come out of there really enthusiastic about Habitat. They get to work alongside the homeowners or the future homeowners. They really hear their story. They can see firsthand the work that they're doing. They're proud of themselves. And then they go out and they might fundraise for Habitat. They spread the word about Habitat. They might pull in more volunteers to build another house for Habitat. Because Habitat does a really good job of directly pulling in the volunteers into direct service activities and connecting the volunteers with the people that they're serving. They have a lot of evangelists. They have a lot of enthusiastic individuals who are really helping to further the cause. This is really about creating meaningful experiences for individuals. So where I currently work, I kind of manage different programs for kids with disabilities. And the nice thing about what we do is the volunteers are directly engaged in the service work. So they're directly working with the kids with disabilities. So we use a lot of volunteers. The more volunteers we have, the more kids we're able to have. And we're able to really keep those volunteers because we're creating meaningful experiences for them. So they directly are able to see the kids that they're helping. They're having fun. The kids are having fun. So they want to come back. And they want to create more opportunities. I volunteered at another organization where I just kind of folded clothes the entire time. The nonprofit did great work in the community, but they were working with a very vulnerable population, so it was really hard for them to utilize volunteers in a meaningful way. I volunteered there for a few months and then I was done. I still love the organization, but I'm not inspired to further it because I just wasn't engaged in it meaningfully. But when you're able to create really positive experiences for individuals, they're going to rally your cause and they're going to keep supporting it. So the next best practice is nurturing nonprofit networks. So this is the idea that you are trying to build collaborations with other nonprofit providers. Keep in mind that this isn't the common frame of mind for a lot of nonprofits. Anyone who currently works in a nonprofit, you probably realize you're kind of in a silo. You don't necessarily want to work with other nonprofits, but you should. It's to your advantage. A lot of nonprofits kind of have the idea of an organization orientation rather than a network orientation. So it's the idea that they're seeing other nonprofits as threats. They're competitors. You're competing against one another for resources. You're focusing on growing your organization, not trying to include other nonprofits in that process. They're really trying to protect their knowledge. We came up with this idea. We don't want to share it with other people. We want to keep our employees. We don't want to share it with other people. But if you want to have, again, the greatest impact, you're going to have to start working with other nonprofits to further your mission, especially if you have nonprofits that share mission statements. You can further what you do by working with others. So it's important that you're partnering with other nonprofits. You can share resources. You can kind of pull your resources together to obtain other resources such as money, knowledge, training, talent. A lot of times you might be too small of a nonprofit to access, even apply for a specific grant, but maybe you can pull in other nonprofits together, and you can apply together. I worked at a child welfare organization in St. Louis, and one thing that they did a really good job at was having a network of nonprofits that they worked with. So they specifically were trying to obtain these foster care case management grants, or their foster care case management contracts. As I mentioned a few classes ago, the state of Missouri does a lot of privatization of foster care case management. So when they have kids who are put into foster care, the foster care case managers, a lot of them, probably about 75% of them, don't work for the state. They work for a nonprofit, and the nonprofit is contracted to provide these foster care case management. But you have a much better chance of getting the case management contract from the state if you're larger. So what several nonprofits did in the St. Louis area was that they pulled their resources together. They kind of created this collaborative where it was like 3 nonprofits, and they would apply together for the foster care case management contract. And they were able to get more funding from the state by pulling their resources. So it's kind of the idea that the sum is greater than the separate parts. So what each of these nonprofits would have received from the state if they had done separate contracts was a lot smaller than when they kind of pulled their resources together and they went in as one collaborative. That was a lot more appealing to the state. A lot of times, another example, so again, I work with kids with disabilities. We're a small nonprofit. There's 2 staff members. So we don't always have the manpower or even the kids to fill an activity. So right now we have these activities going on at the Magic House where we have, who doesn't love the Magic House? The Magic House is providing these kind of like these sensory friendly Saturday morning experiences. So kids with autism can't always enjoy the Magic House because it's way too overstimulating. So what they've provided is for our nonprofit to use the Magic House for free for an hour, so that kids with autism in the community can really enjoy the Magic House. We don't have enough kids to fill the Magic House even for an hour, so we networked with other nonprofits who did similar things to try to get their kids to join us as well, because we have it available, we don't have enough space. If we want to continue this with the Magic House, we need to fill it somewhat and have more than 10 kids show up. So that's why we networked with other nonprofits to create a collaborative experience so that kids throughout the area, regardless of whether they were or were not involved in our specific nonprofit, were able to participate. Going back a little, so your third lecture question was looking at Kristen worked at a nonprofit who combined with other nonprofits for foster care case management contracts. That's your third lecture question, foster care case management contracts. Okay, so the next one is mastering the art of adaptation. So you need to be able to change with the environment. When there's things that are going on in the outside world, you need to be changing alongside it. You can't have a stagnant nonprofit. You have to be able to adapt your services, what you're providing, based on kind of what's going on with the changing times. So it's important that you are constantly adapting, modifying what you're doing, and that you have organizational structure in place to foster creativity and to execute new ideas. A lot of nonprofits don't necessarily have this. A lot of nonprofits are so concentrated on just doing what they're doing the best way possible that they're not always open to new ideas. So it's important that you're constantly generating new ideas and you're able to kind of execute that idea. If you have a new idea, you bring it to your supervisor. Is it going to get tossed aside, or are they going to work with you on putting that into place? So you're constantly experimenting, innovating, and also looking at the environment, your external cues, so you can see what do we need to be doing differently to make sure that we're going to constantly be staying updated, and we're always going to be kind of fresh with the times. So it's kind of a balance between bureaucracy and creativity. A lot of organizations have really strong bureaucracy. So there's a lot of steps it takes to get to the top. So you need some bureaucracy to provide structure to the organization, but you have too much bureaucracy that you're never going to be able to make any change. And that's always going to be important because you're going to have to change with the times. The last best practice is the idea of sharing leadership. So who's been involved with an organization where they feel like they have really no change? They are not really able to be in charge of something. I have. It's a terrible feeling. You don't want to continue doing what you're doing if you don't feel that you really have the authority to make real change, just even within the small program that you're doing. Being able to share leadership is the idea that you're sharing power with other people. You shouldn't just have one executive director who is making all of the decisions. Number one, they don't have the time to make all of the decisions. There's not enough time in the day for them to spend all of their time micromanaging other people. When you kind of are able to delegate activities, you're going to be empowering your team to take on new tasks. If they have actual authority to make decisions and they're being held accountable for their success, they're going to be much more motivated to take on new tasks. And they're going to be very excited and enthusiastic with their project. And then they're going to be able to put a lot more time and effort into it than you would if you were doing all of these separate activities on your own. So it's important that you don't just have one executive director. You have an executive director and a team below them that are working together. The other part of this is having a large and strategic board of directors. So our board of directors, as I mentioned before, are the individuals who are helping to govern the organization. So they're not doing, the day-to-day service provision, but they're helping move the organization forward. And it's important that you have a variety of people on the board of directors. It needs to be diverse. So not just diverse when we think gender, income, racial diversity, those are all important, but we're also talking about diversity of skills, of perspectives, of social networks. We need people who are, connected across a variety of networks, different business fields. Some people might be in human resources, some people might be in finance, so that they all have different strengths that they're going to be pulling in to help lead the organization. Again, one of the organizations I worked at previously had a really nice structure of subcommittees. So they had their board of directors. They had like 20 people on their board of directors, which is a little big. And then within that, they had, a subcommittee for finance, subcommittee for human resources, a subcommittee for marketing, and they probably had like 6 subcommittees. And not everyone on the subcommittees necessarily were part of the executive board, but they had really strong subcommittees that were then able to provide very specific suggestions to the executive director. They had a human resources subcommittee, and the director of human resources for the organization led it and was able to get all of these really great advisors from the business world who was providing them with advice on how they should be moving forward. So the last lecture question of the day is a strong executive board should have subcommittees for finance, HR, marketing, all of the above. Should be all of the above. So keep that in mind when you're trying to build a nonprofit, that you have a wide range of people helping you. Okay, that is it for this week's lecture. Your week 10 activities, which is due on April 5th, next Thursday. Number 1 is your lecture quiz. Number 2 is a short reflection, thinking about those high impact nonprofits. So we talked about 6 practices of high impact nonprofits that all came from the book Forces for Good. So think about that first chapter of Forces for Good. What I want you to do is select 3 of the best practices and apply them to an actual nonprofit with whom you've had some experience. So that might be a nonprofit that you were employed at, currently employed at, previously employed at, or a nonprofit you volunteered at, or a nonprofit you did a practicum or internship at. So think about a nonprofit, or it can be multiple nonprofits. You don't have to only think about one nonprofit. So think about a nonprofit you worked at and provide me with examples of how the nonprofit did or did not implement 3 of the best practices. So it might be that, give me an example of how the nonprofit you worked at did a really nice job of doing advocacy work and service work. Or you can talk about how the nonprofit you worked at was really bad about having networks with other nonprofits, how they weren't able to further their mission because they didn't implement that, or how they were constantly adapting or weren't adapting. So choose 3 of the best practices, give me like a paragraph that explains how a nonprofit you worked at was really able to implement that or not implement that. It would be 1 to 2 pages about your nonprofit. Any questions? Feel free to reach out if you need further clarification on that. What do we have coming up? So everyone should have turned in their community meeting reflection by now. It was due yesterday, so I'm posting this on Friday. It was due this past Thursday, so you should have turned that in. So what we have coming up is the community assessment paper, which I talked about previously. This is due on April 19th. I'm not going to go into this extensively because everyone should have watched last week's PowerPoint, week 9 PowerPoint. Listen to my explanation of the community assessment paper. But essentially, you're going to be taking your evidence-based question and answering it in a 10 to 12 page paper. So you're going to talk about background of the problem, what's currently going on to address the problem, what's not currently going on to address the problem, and then make your recommendation. So based on the research that you found, you need to be using, I think it's like 5 scholarly sources, so peer-reviewed journal articles that are going to help address your question. You get extra credit if you take it to the University Writing Services. I'll look at rough drafts that are sent to me by April 16th. I would highly suggest sending me your rough draft. Last semester, these weren't the best papers, and the people who sent them to me in advance had much better papers because I can give you specific feedback, and if you address those feedback, your grade will be much better. So please send them to me. Don't wait to start this until April 18th or the morning of April 19th. This is a long paper. So any questions on that, please let me know. I'll continue talking about this until we get there. Okay, thanks everyone.